I will not say that the veteran failed the treatment failed the veteran. Our research now can go towards bringing forward these breakthrough treatments that have shown promising impacts, but had not been adequately invested.
Welcome, everybody, once again to the Military Retirement Podcast, where we try to dig into some interview questions with retirees, veterans, and those also getting ready to retire soon, but mainly retirees that have retired recently. Today, I'm with a special guest, Ms. Loree Sutton. She is a Army psychiatrist and a retired brigadier general, and she's going to be discussing with us her military transition. And then we're also going to be talking about some things about PTSD. So let's get into it. Thank you for joining us, Loree.
Oh, it's great to be here, John. Thank you.
So I just want to start off real quick and kind of like put the pin in the map from the end all the way to the beginning and kind of just like ask you, what would make this a very successful interview for you? What would be some things that you'd look for to make this the most useful, beneficial time for you?
I would call this interview a success if it reaches out and connects with the needs, the strengths, the questions, the frustrations that either service members who are preparing to retire recently or remotely retired old soldiers like me and their families. If I can provide some resources, some lessons learned from my own experience. And then, as you said, talking about PTSD, that's a particular focus of mine. And I'd like to really be able to help folks understand where we are and what needs to happen to move us forward out of this current epidemic of veteran suicides that we're in.
Yeah, we're definitely going to jump into the PTSD, the deep end of that for sure at the end of this interview, or maybe in the middle of the interview, depending on how it goes. Let me try to get a snapshot or a picture or an idea of where you were and what happened that made you raise your right hand and join the military when you decided to come in.
It's funny. I happen to agree with Steve Jobs when he said, you don't understand life living it forward. It's only when you look back and you can connect the dots that, things start to make sense. Certainly that's the case with me. I grew up in a very small town in Southern California, Loma Linda, California. In my family, my dad, he had actually enlisted in the Army, served as a journalist in Korea. I wouldn't have thought of that as being an influence going forward, but looking back, certainly it was an influence. I saw him with pictures in his uniform and his old boots and things like that. But we also had another family friend, Corporal Desmond Doss, who was a medic in World War II. And he was a conscientious objector as well as a Medal of Honor recipient for his work at Okinawa. And he used to come over for Sunday dinners, and the grandkids would all sit around and say, "Hey, Uncle Desmond, tell us about the war." And he'd launch into it like it's the first time he had told the story. And there was something about that experience that I think stuck with me. And, I didn't get any support from parents, teachers, or coaches to look at the military. It wasn't something that, to my knowledge, anyone in my high school class had done. But I was sitting, now take it a few years later, I was in organic chemistry class in college, small college, Northern California, not exactly a hotbed for military recruiting. But in walked two Air Force medical recruiters. And they laid it out, what the opportunity is for applying for what they call the Health Professional Scholarship Program. I had no idea. I guess I didn't even realize that the service academies had opened to women just the year before. As I heard about this opportunity to apply for a scholarship, what stuck with me was they said, get a letter of acceptance to medical school, come see us, and you can apply for the scholarship. And so 2 years later, I had that letter. I was back in Southern California, my hometown, and I was going to go meet my high school buds down at the beach, Laguna Beach. And I told them, you guys go on down there. I'll meet you in the afternoon, because the medical recruiting center was in Santa Ana. And so I drove down there, I walked in, and I just was sort of flummoxed because it never occurred to me I'd have to choose a service. So here you had these 4 kiosks. And this is actually the truth this time. It was crazy. But I looked at my watch and I said, oh man, I only have time to apply for one scholarship. And the Army line was the shortest. And that's how I ended up in the Army. Looking back, I think it was providence. It was fate. It was certainly the best decision for me, but I had told nobody about it. And I didn't tell anyone about it until I had gotten accepted, signed up for the scholarship. So I was immediately put on more prayer lists around my hometown and community. In fact, my aunt and uncle, they were missionaries in the Philippines. They got word of it, even in the Philippines. So it was quite a disruption to the home front. But it turns out it just was the best thing I could have ever done.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, it sounds like moving forward, and as we get into your career path and getting out, and then things that you were accomplishing at the end there, and even now today, it sounds like you've got kind of that disruptive gene in your bloodstream, maybe. But we'll find out.
We'll find out. You bet we will.
So when you did come in, what was the expectation that you had, and did the Army meet that expectation for you, or how was it?
I really didn't have any expectations, but the way the Health Professional Scholarship Program works, it's HPSP for short, you spent your first summer after the first year of medical school in basic training. So I trundled down to Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio, and one of the first nights, I'll never forget this, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden, there was just this solid wall of sound. I jumped straight up. What is this? And looked out, and there was a brigade, probably 350, 400 strong, of Army privates who were belting out Jody calls at the top of their lungs for morning PT. And as I listened to them, there was one Jody call in particular that just really struck me at a very deep level, and it's stuck with me ever since. It goes like this: we like it here, we love it here. We finally found a home. And then it goes into like a round. A home. We finally found a home. And there was just something about that call. I thought, I think maybe I found a home. And 30 years later, there's no doubt the Army was the best home possible for me and what I wanted to bring to the world and what it has now prepared me to keep bringing to the world. I wanted to leave the Army and the armed services in a little different shape than what I found them to be. Let me explain that. I've had sort of a lifelong quest towards becoming whole. My medical school, Loma Linda University, the motto for this school is to make man whole. And of course, if they were coming up with the motto these days, it would be to make humans whole or folks whole or whatever, but to make man whole. And every day between classes, there's a big statue of the Good Samaritan and the motto of the school. And it was reflected in our curriculum. So I had a very holistic grounding. Plus, my grandfather was an old town, country doc from Texas, and he would take me on house calls. My mother was a nurse, a founding nurse in the international heart team for Loma Linda University. So I guess I had some of it in my DNA, you might say. But I really I look back, and it's easy to connect the dots now, looking backwards. Looking forwards, I was just kind of an experienced junkie, and I was very patriotic, at a time when, there were psychedelic colors and flowers and all kinds of things going on in California. I would draw, Peter Max mushrooms on one side of the pager, and then, red, white, and blue flags on the other. And it just, those two elements coexisted for me from the very beginning. And I guess it's been reflected throughout these last now going on 4 decades.
Yeah, it's incredible. The experiences and how they overlap. And it's really, I mean, it's how you find your passions in life. It's how you figure out what you want to do when you grow up. You take the amalgamation of all the experiences and you kind of just blend it all together and overlay it and see what kind of fits where. And funny enough, if you draw like that little magic circle in the middle and kind of capture the edges of everything that come together, you start to see it. At least later on in your life, you'll for sure see it, but you can kind of piece together like what actually makes sense and what drives your passions and what will keep you motivated to get out of bed every single morning and go to work and put in the 10 or 12 hours that you need to put in for the passion project, which then can become a
I
career.
love that. The passion project. You know, one of the biggest gifts my parents gave me was that they loved their work. I never heard them on Sunday afternoon or evening say, oh gosh, got to go back to the office tomorrow. They loved their work. And that was, I think, just such a gift because I brought that spirit. You know, I knew that I wanted to, figure out why was I put on this earth? What's my God-given gift? How can I summon the wisdom and the courage to live and give it as they did? And one of the life-altering influences then occurred in, I think that would have been the late 80s. It's when Joseph Campbell had a series of interviews with Bill Moyers in the late 80s. And, Joseph Campbell, of course, he had written The Power of Myth and so many other just captivating tales of the world's religions and the world's mythologies and the stories that people have told each other in different countries, different cultures all over the world. And so when I first heard those interviews, I just thought, this is changing my life. This rings true to everything that I am, to everything that I know, and everything that I aspire to become in preparing myself to lead. And it was just maybe a couple, 3-4 years later when my unit, the 1st Armored Division, was called to lead the heavy push, sort of the Hail Mary hook for the first Gulf War. My mom asked me, what book would you like to bring? I was stationed in Germany at the time. We were deploying from a forward deployed location. And I answered immediately, Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth. And I still have that book now. It's kind of crunchy. It has sand still in between the pages. But it, again, one of those factors that served as just such an influential guide. And to this day, every Easter, I reread the initial interview with Bill Moyers and Joseph Campbell, which led to the video interviews. It was in, New York Times, Eugene Kennedy had an Easter interview with Joseph Campbell, and it is just one of the most inspiring and inclusive and unsettling, and yet still provocative. It stirs you up and leaves you in a different shape than what you started when you started reading the article. Every year I get something new from it. It's just one of those works, and it led me then later to the video series.
Yeah, it's the cool thing about evergreen content. I have a bunch of stuff like that, and I think we're going to touch on some books here somewhere in the interview. But I did want to ask you, I wanted to kind of dive into something you mentioned about your parents, how they loved to go to work and they weren't grumbling on Sunday evening. And I'm sure they weren't like, oh, thank God it's Friday and we've got the weekend.
Right.
Where did that, do you happen to were you able to ask your parents that, like where they got that kind of motivation from or that drive from? Or did you ever kind of like pick it apart and think about it and figure out where that actually came from?
As a matter of fact, I did. Starting with my mom's side, her parents, what an inspiration. My grandfather, we called him Dandy. My grandmother, we called her Nana. My granddad grew up on a cotton and cattle range in Hereford, Texas, in the Panhandle. His dad died when my grandfather was 9 or 10 years old. He had 5 brothers and sisters. He became the man of the family, dropped out of school and really helped his mom run the ranch. My grandmother was just over the state line in Hagerman, New Mexico. And she was, a second generation Swedish immigrant. Her name was Volga Bell Jacobson. And her mother died when she was quite young. And she as well had 5 or 6 siblings. And she became, the mother of the family. And they met then at camp meeting, one of those summers, when they were teenagers by then. This is what's so funny. My granddad, he would tell the story about how he had noticed my grandmother, and he was kind of shy. And he noticed, all of these young men, kind of gathered around her and trying to get her attention. He said, I can't compete. And then he decided what he could do. He walked on his hands. He was so strong from driving the teams of horses and working the cattle ranch that he walked on his hands around the perimeter of the camp meeting. Well, sure enough, Volga B, as he called her, she noticed him, and they started up a multi-year correspondence because she still had work to do with her family, raising her siblings. He still had work to do at his home. And years later, after this, I think it was close to 10 years correspondence, they married after his first quarter in medical school. So this was now during the Depression. She was teaching in Pasadena. He went to, my alma mater as well, Loma Linda University. And what's crazy about this is my grandmother, if you can imagine, she got her MBA in the 1920s, and she was teaching business in Pasadena. Now, once my grandparents got married, within a year or two, she was pregnant. But at that time, if she had let her school leadership know that, she would have been fired. So she just wore a big old dark coat, and she was big bone Swedish. She worked all the way up till the day of delivery. And my grandfather, on the other hand, he graduated from medical school. Now it's the height of the Depression. They've got one child and another on the way. They moved to Arizona. You can take the farm hand off the farm in Texas, but you can't take the ranch out of the farm hand. And he bought some property in Arizona, and that's where they went. My grandmother, she didn't have any background in nursing or medicine, but he taught her how to assist him, and they would go around. They knew the importance of dignity and pride. So, for example, if they'd go treat someone who had a cold or was sick or even delivered a baby, if they had a cup of milk, they'd accept that, or an eggs, anything that would just help the family, help the individual, help the community feel a sense of dignity. So that's how they got started out, and work was always something that they just threw themselves into. And, even decades later, my grandmother could run circles around me as a kid. And so I've always had so much respect for both. My grandfather worked until he practiced medicine until he was almost 90. And wow. I had the chance to go on house calls to really watch him in action and to see how important relationships were. When we went on house calls or when he was at his office and seeing patients there, he would never just walk in and say, so what's wrong? He would walk in and ask about the kids and the Little League and how's your job coming? How's your husband? He'd find out, he'd catch up with his patients and ask about their lives. And of course, you can get a lot of information from that as well, but you also establish trust and rapport. And it was something that I always observed, and it struck me, and I've carried that with me as well. My mother then, she, coming from that background, she then decided to go into nursing. And in the early 60s, when open heart surgery was still a very new phenomenon, because they couldn't do it until they had the technology to create the heart-lung machine so that you could run the blood and keep the body oxygenated while you did heart surgery. And so she was a member of the Loma Linda University heart team, international heart team. They went to Pakistan, they went to Greece, they went to Saudi Arabia, and what they were intent on always doing was not just going over there as the experts and doing surgeries and coming home, but going to different countries and working with their local healthcare system so that they could train up professionals and leave that capacity with the local communities, the local healthcare teams, which again struck me as something very important, to always be able to give whatever it is that we have, to be able to give it to people so that they can then exert agency, they can then take pride in their own community and stay connected. So that's on one side of the family. That was my mom's side. My dad's side, boy, he started out, his parents, his father was a missionary, and on his maiden missionary voyage by ship down to Central and South America, he had a wife and a 10-year-old daughter. His wife got ill and died, had to be buried at sea. So if you can imagine, he arrived down in Panama, a widower, a 10-year-old daughter, and here he is supposed to be, leading the missionary efforts with the Davis Indians and going out into the brush and all of the rest that was involved. Well, the community, of course, rallied around and supported him. But within a few months, he happened to notice the church secretary, who was a very proper young British Portuguese woman named Cristina Silva. Well, Cristina Silva became my grandmother and then became the mother of my dad. And so my dad was homeschooled by my grandmother for 12 years. And then eventually, and he loved, he loved politics. When he was 5, 6 years old, they said, "Arthur, what would you like for your birthday this year?" Well, he wanted a subscription to Time magazine, which he then read cover to cover. He went to local political rallies. That they were living in Guyana. At one point, there was a lot going on with the Jagan family and the move for independence. And this little tyke of a guy, he just he loved it, and that became part of the blueprint for his life. Then eventually, they sent him up to boarding academy when he was 13 years old. This was in Enterprise, Kansas, and he got out of there as soon as he could. He graduated from high school early. He never quite made the circumstances of his affiliation with the Army clear to his parents. Of course, they were still back in Central and South America. And as he confessed to me in later life, yes, he did enlist in the Army. He deployed to Korea. The Korean War was then going on, and he served there as a journalist. So I guess years later, when I sort of did my Army thing and didn't tell anybody and didn't make the circumstances too clear, that day down in Santa Ana, there was certainly a genetic tie there. So what my dad then ended up doing, he loved politics. He ended up in California working for President Nixon, who was then Vice President Nixon in the 50s. Fascinating. Years later, when Nixon was in the White House and when the Watergate scandal started to unfold, nobody in 1972, 73 thought that it went all the way up to the Oval Office. My dad, from the moment that story broke, he said, "You watch, there's no way that Nixon wasn't involved in this and didn't have full knowledge and, ownership." So we had so much fun growing up, talking politics. He loved music. He had thousands of records. He loved gospel music, Mahalia Jackson. He loved jazz. It was just a really, he had a spirit of life that I cherish as a gift. He died all too soon. He died when I was 15. My mom then died a few years ago, and now in 2008. So they've been both gone for a number of years, but they still live on in my day-to-day life and my heart.
Yeah, I think we found the answer, that the kind of disruptor gene has been passed on through the generations of your family to you. So I think
No
it was onto
question.
something. So I want to fast forward to getting close to the end of your career, around that last, let's say, 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, even up to the last year. I generally, my transition from the military to retirement started about 4.5 years out. Like at my last duty station, I got on the ground, and my first interview with the chief of staff, and I was like, I'm getting out. I'm retiring. I'm just going to let you know that up front, so you can take me off all of your little bubble charts. And they didn't really like that answer, and they were like, hey, chief, you can stick around. And I was like, I'm not going to stick around. It's not going to happen. But yeah, I was actually contemplating getting out before retirement time, and I got talked off the ledge by a couple friends, and then decided to just finish it out. But I like to think it's like that last couple of years, hopefully you don't wait until the last like 60 days and decide, I'm going to retire and what do I need to do now? But what does that last few years look like, and what were kind of like the things that were going on in your mind in that time, and what kind of drove your decision, and then later push you down that step-by-step path?
Sure. Well, there were a couple of clear decision points. One, back to when I was getting ready to graduate from residency training, so many of my peers, we were just obsessed with the question, are you going to stay in or are you going to get out? And I finally asked there's a retired Spec 5, Tom Tabor, who was the unit clerk. He'd been around forever. I said, Tom, help me out. I don't know how to answer that question. He said, Doc, give it up. You've got 4 years of payback time. Why would you worry about that question? Here's what you do. Do everything in uniform that you can't do out of uniform, and then you'll know it's either in your blood and you'll have a great career to follow, or it's not, but you'll be an ambassador because you'll be able to tell folks what you experienced and what you learned. It was the best advice I could have ever got. So I did that. I did everything in uniform that I couldn't do out of uniform. And that took me to the Sinai, Egypt, on the Multinational Force and Observers Agreement with an infantry battalion, of all things, as a woman mental health officer. That took me to Germany. Then I was the first Armored Division psychiatrist, 25,000 troops spread all out over Middle Franconia, and then called a year later to be the lead heavy armored division in the first Gulf War. So within 2 years of residency training, because of Tom's advice, I've had more experience in both peacekeeping operations and combat than anyone else in my career field. And more importantly, I'd fallen in love with our troops and their families. And I just felt like it turned my world upside down. I never had anticipated that I would stay for a career or any time really past my payback time. But that experience, those first 2 years, I came back from the first Gulf War, and I just realized that if I could even make a little bit of difference in supporting the health and the wholeness and the well-being of our troops and their loved ones, that would be a life worth living. And so I stayed in for nearly 30 years. And you asked about towards the end then what that process was like. So in the meantime, I had more operational experience, more just an amazing series of mentors and experiences. I was a White House Fellow. I was division surgeon for the 4th Infantry Division. I was on the faculty at the Uniformed Services University. As my mom said, she says, Loree, you never have been able to keep a job, have you? But it really was the perfect thing for me. And so as I was assuming my duties at Fort Hood, this was the second time I'd been stationed there. I'd been the 4th Infantry Division surgeon towards the end of the 90s, 98 to 2000. And now I was back, and it was 2005, and we were in the middle of operations, the war in Iraq. And it was really gripping, living war on the home front as the commander of the hospital for the largest and busiest power projection platform in the inventory that had been going back and forth deployments, 4th Infantry Division, alternating with 3rd Corps, 3 Corps, and 1st Cavalry Division, back and forth, back and forth. They caught Saddam. I mean, it was just an endless grind. And during that time of the war, it was on average every other day, every third day, we have to tell a family that their loved one was not coming home. And regularly, almost every day, we have to tell families that their loved one was coming home, but was wounded, ill, injured, and would require ongoing care. So it was a gripping time. And as my main tour started to draw to an end, I'd been selected. I was fortunate. I'd been selected as the command surgeon to serve under General Petraeus during the surge in Iraq. And following that selection, I connected with the existing surgeon, who was a guy named Colonel Brian Allgood. And I'll tell you, I'd known and worked with Brian for several years. And I told him this well before we all grieved his loss and agreed that he truly lived up to his name. Brian was on a Chinook that was shot down January of 2007 in Iraq. We had been on the, back and forth email, phone. We wanted to make sure there was a strong battle handoff. So it was devastating when he went down. And, it just made me pumped up all the more. Wanted to march in his boot prints. I wanted to honor his service. And then the next month, February of 2007, that's when the Walter Reed scandal hit the Washington Post. And all of a sudden, the Army is in a tumult. Lost the Army secretary, the Surgeon General, the commander at Walter Reed. And by the way, there were some leadership issues there that it was good that there was accountability. But the aftermath was just fearsome. And, within just a few days, I don't think it was tied to each other, but as we were trying to figure out how do we navigate through this, I got word that, I'd been nominated for promotion to Brigadier General. And, I kicked and screamed a little bit about still wanting to go to Iraq. I was so vested in that mission. But after the acting Surgeon General, Gail Pollock, whom I'd also worked with for years, said, Loree, ain't going to happen. You tell me, how can we best use your background, your skill set, your knowledge and experience as an 07? And I thought about it for a hot minute and said, put a DOD patch on me. We've got years to make up for with unseen wounds of war. And the Beltway then became my battlefield. And I PCS to DC in the summer of 2007. And by that time, there had been all of these commissions, 4, 5, 6 commissions that had dozens and dozens of recommendations, like the Dole-Shalala Commission. There were others. And DOD accepted over 200 of these recommendations. And I was then named as the director of the Center of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury. And that became my first skirmish upon arriving. It was to suggest to my new boss that actually, rather than 2 centers, they assumed there would be 1 center for psychological health and 1 center for traumatic brain injury. I said, well, it's all the same organ. Why don't we make it, why don't we integrate this? And so I won that battle. But then I'll never forget, every good military unit has a coin. So of course this was no different. So I'd given some thought to what our coin could be. And I approached, I had a group of folks from my field, the mental health field, 05, 06s, colonels, as well as folks from the TBI field, so neurologists, and then I had folks from the physical medicine, rehab medicine field, and we were all talking about, what was going on. And then I, floated this idea about the coin. What would you all think about a brain coin for what, this mission is going to be designed, its intention to really address brain health and the injuries that were becoming so apparent with the signature weapon of those wars, the uh, explosive devices, as we well know, and the devastating impact that they have. We were getting young men and women back with injury, wounds, and illness profiles that were more complex than anything we'd seen, because of course we'd improved our ability to resuscitate, to treat open wounds on the battlefield and head trauma. And so this was a very, very taxing time, and we had years to make up for when our leaders had thought this was going to be a cakewalk and hadn't given the resources or the leadership or the time or the effort to really prepare. Well, so folks in my field looked at my mock-up of this coin, which was a brain in the background and the shadow of a warrior with a backpack, the ruck taking a knee, and said, "What is this? What does the brain have to do with what we do?" And I couldn't believe it. This was in 2007. I thought, if you were a mechanic and said, "What does the engine have to do with my job?" I let it go, and they got into a very heated argument here. Well, of course, the TDI folks, they were all very smug. Well, at least what we deal with is the brain. We deal with real injuries. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be tough. And then my lifeline became the rehab specialist, because they just looked and they said, "Man, absolutely, let's have a brain coin. All we care about is what works. How can we get our troops back to living lives of purpose and passion and meaning and jumping out of perfectly good airplanes once again?" So that was the beginning of that tour. But it was such a tense time. There was nothing in our senior leadership, either on the uniform side up to 4 stars or the senior civilian side. There was nothing that had prepared them for the complexities of brain injuries and the wound, illness, and injury profiles that I mentioned earlier. And so there was still this notion that, if we just hire the right general, if we just put enough money into it, we can take that hill. And, it's just not quite that simple. And I knew early on, I told General Pollock, I said, let's listen, whoever comes into this position, I would think of myself as a sin eater. When you look at cultures that Native Americans that have the role of a sin eater who absorbs the projections and the tax and the blame for what's not going well in the community. And I said, if I can just absorb all of that while I'm working like crazy to build a team and to get this operation on track, that frees up our senior leaders to do what only they can do. And there was a book that came out about that time called The Spider and the Starfish. And it was about leadership. And I told my team, we started out with me, and by 3 years later, when I stepped aside, we had nearly 200 folks. And what we had done is we had really connected a network of networks, a center of centers, bringing 5 existing centers together that I had worked with their leadership for years. And the pull was that I could offer them planned budgeting if they came into my network. They'd always gone year to year. Even we stood up a new center for technology, and then we designed the NICO, the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which has now become really the world's premier brain rehabilitation and integrative center for research, for education, for clinical treatment. We modeled it after Mayo Clinic, where, folks would come from their post camps and stations, come to NICO for 2, 3, 4 weeks, get a treatment plan, get enrolled in research, have family education, and then go back to their post camps and stations and stay connected with the NICO leadership. So it was just, it was the best of times. It was the toughest of times. And I told my team, I said, listen, right now, somebody takes me out, we're a spider organization. That's it. But my goal here, and I need your help, is by the time I depart, we have to be a starfish organization so that I can leave, but we're a starfish organization and the mission will go on. And by the time I left 3 years later, absolutely, we were a starfish organization, and I'm so proud of the way that work has moved forward. I now, in my civilian veteran advocate capacity, I work with the commander of NICO, and now it's a whole network of networks. We've got 10 spirit centers all over the enterprise, and it's just so exciting to see how that has grown and flourished. And so while I didn't anticipate that I would leave when I did, I really thought I'd be in the Army for another 10 years. It became clear to me with the leadership that was in place at that time. It was a very difficult time. The Chief of Staff of the Army and the Vice Chief of Staff despised each other. There was a lot of finger pointing. We were in the middle of a suicide epidemic that had started really in 2009 and continued to march upwards, and which is still with us today. It spread to the veteran community, and now, of course, you may be aware, but since the turn of the century, since the year 2000, all around our society, our civilian society, suicides have increased 30%, over 30%, nearly 50,000 last year. And so it was not a time for a change agent like myself to stay in uniform. I had some scrapes, some scripts. I'd taken some bumps and lumps and scrapes and scratches along the way, and it was time for me to step aside, which I did. If you go back to that time, you'll see there were over 20 national news stories all puzzling over why General Sutton so abruptly stepped aside. So there was no scandal. In fact, if anything, the better our team did, we'd established trusting relationships with the media because we saw their role and appreciated their role when they would come to me and, point out something or publish something, and that would come to my attention that, something that was going wrong, we would thank them. They were our early warning system. We'd thank them and say, thank you. Let us know. We're not only going to fix it for that family or that soldier, we're going to fix the system so that nobody has to go through that again. Well, when you develop that kind of trust, then, the media, the reporters, they know that if they can trust you to acknowledge when things aren't going well, they can sure trust you when you tell them, hey, check this out. We're really proud of this. It is going well. And so it was it was a difficult time. But I guess the high point really was the day in June of 2010 when the NICO was open. And it was just such a crown jewel, and yet it was easily the toughest day of my nearly 30 years in uniform. There was a story on NPR that morning that puzzled about this bizarre situation with General Sutton abruptly stepping aside. Everyone in D.C. listens to NPR in the morning, so I arrive at the ceremony and, I felt like damaged goods. I didn't want to taint anyone by association, so I looked around the reception before the ceremony, and there was an E7 from, where was he from? He was from Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I went over there and said, hey, Sarge, how are you doing? What brings you here? Well, he explained to me that, he and his buddies had been invited to come to the opening, and And I asked him, I said, well, so what do you think of what you've seen so far? John, he looked at me, his eyes sort of filled with tears, and he said, ma'am, he says, before today, I didn't think that anyone believed me or my buddies who are suffering from PTSD. He says, but seeing this center and seeing all of this work and sure, he says, I know that we do matter. I got to tell you, that was like catching a wave. And I went in, sat down, I was supposed to be on the dais. This was something we worked for years. It didn't matter. Jim Kelly, there's a picture in Military Times of Jim Kelly. He was the best hire, the best decision I could have made. He's a leading behavioral neurologist, and I had hired him a couple of years earlier to, stand up and run the NICO. And it was just one of the proudest moments, but one of the most difficult moments. And that afternoon, as I was thinking about how my life in uniform had taken such an unusual and unexpected turn, I made myself a promise. And I said, I am going to take whatever time is needed and do whatever is required to move beyond this experience and to find a way somehow to embrace it as a gift, to be grateful, and to use this experience to help others and to prevent others from having to ever go through what this has been like. And that became, I kind of chuckled when I heard myself say that, but I really meant it. And it took a while. It took a couple of years before I even had a framework for understanding, because here I am as a psychiatrist, and I couldn't figure out what in the world had happened. I scoured the bullying literature. Some of it fit, but it fell so woefully short of what it was that I had experienced in totality. And I thought, this is really kind of crazy. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, I was in Oxford, my then wife, Loree, yes, her name's Loree as well, spelled differently, but she's a psychologist, and we had stood up an organization, a brain training organization, Threshold Global Works, and we were giving a presentation there in Oxford, and we went to the bookstore, and I was drawn to this book. It said, On Mobbing. I picked it up. The first page that I read said that mobbing victims, this is a group, first of all, to provide a little context, it's a primitive instinct among animal groups, including humans. It occurs with birds. Alfred Hitchcock memorialized that in the movie in the 60s and 70s. Was coined by Konrad Lorenz, a Nobel laureate for biology. You see it in Nazi Germany. You see it in the Yale prison experiments. You see it in healthcare settings. You see it in military, which is a mobbing-prone organization. You see it at condo meetings. Where groups of people are where the group dynamic becomes warped, and where typically it happens when there's some stress or distress. A group is under duress, and a member of the group becomes targeted, and people within that group will then do and say things within that group they would never do or say as individuals. And it doesn't go well for the person who's mobbed. And so as I'm reading this book, it was a book written by two clinical researchers. This was their life work. And they said that for individuals who are mobbed, the impact, the health impact, the impact on the immune system is profound. And it is akin to what we see in concentration camp survivors. When I read that paragraph, I said, okay, this now can make sense. And I, bought that book, and subsequently they come out with a handbook and a third book. And then I met Maureen Duffy, who's one of the co-authors. I met her at the Women's Memorial in DC, and I told her about how her work had just utterly changed my life and how I'd been able to use it, much like I had envisioned that day of the NICO opening. I could never have imagined how one thing would lead to another, but I had been able to help others just by even using the word mobbing. I'd never gone into the details of my own experience, but acknowledging what it is had had such an incredible impact. And so she said, hey, well, I'm finishing up a 2-volume set on the HR, the human resources, and the legal framework that undergirds this process. And it really provides leaders and human resource professionals with the tools and the knowledge they need. Would you write a blurb on the back? So it came full circle. To save my life, I was able to then write that blurb and continue to this day, wherever I have a chance to use the term and then explain it. And it's amazing, John, that the heads that then nod knowingly. And so that was my transition. I didn't have time to prepare. I told folks that I was going to go out to New Mexico. I'd gotten some property there after the first Gulf War, and that I was just going to go and just rest for a while. And by the way, even under normal or circumstances of transition, I recommend it to folks, even if you have a chance to take even a month off, but preferably if you can, 3 to 6 months off, something to just exhale and sort of air out a little bit from the intensity of what you've been through and the privilege of what it means to wear the uniform. But in my case, I didn't have that. And I was, I had been told that I was not to contact any of my previous team members. So I was socially isolated. When it was time to plan a retirement ceremony, I mean, initially, after, I was pulled out of the NICO director position, I was supposed to report to the Army Surgeon General where they had a broom closet I was supposed to work in as an office. And I just decided, no, it's time to go. And the Army agreed. And so I never did assume that follow-on assignment, but rather moved directly into planning my retirement ceremony. That itself became an issue because it wasn't that I didn't have lots and lots of support relationships that had been forged through decades of serving together, but I didn't want to harm anyone's career by association with me. I couldn't ask another general officer to lead out, in my retirement ceremony. And about that time, it's just energy. You put the energy out in the universe, and what came back in this instance was Max Cleland. I'd never met Max Cleland before, but he had read what had happened, had heard about this puzzling, abrupt departure, and he'd asked his friends and colleagues, so what is this about Sutton? And he called me up. He said, they told me it's the real deal, and she got a raw deal. So I'm calling you now, Doc, because I want to know. He says, I want to know what I can do to help support you. And I said, I got just the role. If you're up for it, would you be willing to co-lead my retirement ceremony? And I said, I can't call it retirement ceremony. So it's a celebration of service. And it had occurred to me that my longtime mentor, General Pat Foote, that she and Max would be the perfect pair. And I just, realized it on the fly as he called, and it came together in the most beautiful way. And then I thought, well, where can I hold it? And I said, again, I've sort of been mobbed from my Army home. And so I reached out to the folks at Bethesda, and I had my celebration of service in the Bethesda Hospital. And then we were able to, it was just beautiful to be able to walk across the street and have the reception in the new NICO. So it was a beautiful thing in its own way. It was wrenching. It was something that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but in as much as it was my experience, I feel proud of how the subsequent what is it now, 14 years, things have really become much more clear in terms of how I can advise or even just talk with other troops and veterans and their family members about this transition process. It's something, it's real. As you well know, you don't have to have an experience like mine to go through the wrenching sensation of all of a sudden you don't have boots to put on in the morning. You don't have, you got to figure out what to wear. You don't have the built-in structure, the purpose, the passion, the meaning. You got to figure all that out. And it can be a very isolating experience under the best of times. And this certainly fell far short of that mark. Let me tell you something else, John, real quick.
Go right ahead.
That celebration of service, because here was the next challenge is how do you honor the entirety of nearly 30 years of experience without giving short shrift to what had happened during the last 3 years. But in fact, the last 3 years, it had been the best of times. I'd done the best work in my career, and it was a rich time of being able to build that team and be creative and do things that had never been done before. But it was the toughest of times. Every time I came back into the Beltway, and I was traveling all over the place during that time and building the team and all the rest, but I'd come back into the Beltway and boy, it was bruising. And so it finally came to me. I wrote a first draft of my remarks, and it wasn't me. It was a little snarky. It was, negative. It was angry. And I said, okay, good. I've written this draft. I can throw that away. And then I came across the quote from Robert F. Kennedy's Cape Town address. And it was called A Tiny Ripple of Hope. And it goes like this: there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than establishing a new order of things. And that was the only reference that I made to what had happened, that mobbing process. But I was able to claim that quote and claim the connection to what it has been for change leaders from centuries back, what it is now, and what it will be centuries forward. Leading change is not easy, never has been. And so I felt like I had some community and some connectivity there. And actually, the preface to that quote was in the words of an Italian philosopher. RFK knew better than to name Machiavelli, but it was a quote from Machiavelli. It was manna to my soul. It was just really, it was one of those things that along this journey, the guides, the phone calls from Max Cleland, the sergeant first class at the reception from Fort Polk, all little nudges from the universe saying, there's life beyond this. You've given what you have. You've paid a price, but, go home, retool, go to New Mexico, renew and refresh your soul, your identity, your purpose. And sure enough, I hadn't been in New Mexico for more than maybe a month. I got called by a movie producer, two of them, Kirby Dick, Amy's Wiring from California, and they were putting together a documentary, The Invisible War. And they asked me if I would be involved as kind of a talking head, as a psychiatrist who could provide the context for military culture with respect to sexual assault and what was really becoming clearly apparent at that point. And of course I said immediately, no, there's no way I'm going to do a gotcha piece on DOD and the Army. This institution that I've given my life to. No, I'm not going to do that. And just as I refused to talk about what had happened to me, other than that little snippet from A Tiny Ripple of Hope, because I thought, as I was, reporters were calling me for several months. I couldn't even use my cell phone because I'd worked with reporters, and when they tried to contact me through my cell phone, I wouldn't answer it. When they called DOD, Public Affairs at the Pentagon, they said crazy things, like, we had to reach out and intervene for her own good and sort of intimate that I was a danger to myself or was actively suicidal. I told them when all this was going on, do a psych eval on me, sure. It was an odd position to be in, but the psychiatrist, sent the report back to the Pentagon. Nope.
The student becomes the teacher.
Nothing to see here. But it was a kind of a crazy, crazy, crazy time. It's come full circle. I knew that I didn't want to tell my story. In fact, I've heard from, folks who overheard in meetings, they weren't all that careful about what was said in staff meetings. There was a, 4-star general who in one staff meeting said, well, I'm going to send Sutton out to, Siberia, get her out of here. And so I knew that privates, lieutenants, troops, family members, all services, of course I'd worked with all services, they didn't need to hear about what had happened to a brigadier general. Can you imagine if this had happened to a brigadier general? How do I stand a chance? How does my family stand a chance? So I never would talk about it, but there was some suspicion that was passed on to me that I would go write a tell-all book, that I would spread this around, and so I acted with extra vigor to make sure that they buried my reputation and their actions with respect to the departure. But no, our troops and their families deserve better than that, and I'm so proud and really just pumped up. I feel as pumped up to continue serving today as I ever did when I was, just signing the bottom line there in Santa Ana, California, so many years ago. So I don't really know how to put any other words to it other than it's time to continue looking forward, and that's what I have been doing since 2010. Yes, nursing my wounds, licking my, chops, trying to figure out what happened to me, and then, doing whatever was needed and taking whatever time was required. And fortunately, I had that stepping stone, the Invisible War. It was amazing. It was nominated for an Academy Award. I'm so proud of the work that we did on that movie. Then I had an opportunity. Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury, he had introduced me and Loree. He ended up then several years later marrying us, but he had recruited us to come from Santa Fe and to come up to his hometown in the Adirondacks, Saranac Lake, and we stood up a veterans reintegration program, Homeward Bound Adirondacks. I served as the board chair for 3 years. Then he and Jane, his wife, they had an extra apartment in Manhattan. So for the better part of a year and a half, we experienced the best of upstate New York and the best of downstate, and we got the bug. And we looked at each other and said, you know what? Why don't we just move to Brooklyn for 3 years and not ask any questions? That's what we did. And within a year, I found out that there was a new mayor in town, and he had not yet appointed his commissioner for what was then the mayor's office of Veterans Affairs. And my Loree, give her huge credit. She's the one who saw the sentence in the New York Times as we were riding down to do suicide prevention work down in the Capitol. And she said, hey, is this something you'd be interested in? And I looked at it and I smiled, and then I smiled again, knowing there was not a chance that I would be selected or be even competitive. What did I have to offer a new mayor? I just moved there, had no real context or network. I had no money. I had nothing that would translate to capital for a new mayor. But throughout my career, when I found myself talking like that, trying, not really negative self-talk,
Right.
I just tried to turn it around and said, well, you know what? You can't win if you don't play. And I said that before I applied for the White House Fellowship. Colin Powell was my mentor from a distance, my closet mentor. When I was training in residency in the 80s, I saw what he had done. He'd gone to the National War College. He'd gone to um, been a White House fellow, and I said, I want to do those things. And you know, uh, doesn't mean you're going to get it, but can't win if you don't play. And I ended up going to the National War College. I ended up being selected as a White House fellow. And in this case, what I didn't know about the new mayor and his bride is that all four of their parents had served during World War II. So they had a particular lived experience with both the blessings and the burdens of being in a military and veteran family. The mayor himself, this came out in the campaign, that his father, who fought at Okinawa and came back, he lost a leg. He brought the war home with him, and he ended up dying by suicide when the mayor was about 18. And so they had these lived experiences. The first lady, she had watched her father struggle with depression. He had been an E7 on the plains of Europe. Her mother was really truly a Rosie the Riveter in Massachusetts. Um, and so they had a resolve. They wanted to hire someone as their new Veterans Affairs Commissioner who could make things different for today's veterans and their families. And of course, by that measure, I was the perfect choice. I told the mayor when I finally had an interview with him, I said, sir, if what you're looking for is a custodian for the status quo, I'm not your person. But if you want to move forward and make things happen that never have been but have long needed to be, let's go. Let's work together. And we did.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's weird how the winding path sort of leads you to where you, and that's why by all means, I didn't want to interrupt and I didn't want to interject or anything like that, and let you continue with the story. And that's what we spoke about before we started the call, was like letting the thread kind of run
Sure.
along the paper to figure out and see what's going on and actually get the deep details. And that's a lot of stuff that I didn't know about. So thank you for sharing all of that with me.
Sure.
It definitely a long answer to a not so long question, but that's the whole point of why we do this and why I do this. And for me, it's the perfect answer. I did want to go back and ask you about New Mexico. You said you took a little bit of time off there. And that's something that I also recommend to folks who are getting out of the military. If you don't know what you want to do, if you don't have something lined up after you get out, or if you're struggling to get something lined up, first of all, like, get your finances in order before you get out. Get
Yes.
to a zero balance if possible, right? And then secondly, once you do that, then you free up a ton of your other resource, which is time.
Yep.
Because you don't have to spend all of your time trying to make all of the money to pay all the bills. You just eliminate as many bills as possible and pay all the debt down, and then you have
Yes.
a ton of time. So that time that you spent in New Mexico, I've only been to New Mexico a couple times. I had a distant aunt that was there the past a few years ago. My dad spent a
Mm.
ton of time in New Mexico working for an uncle that we had there. But what was the most beneficial thing that you got from that time that you spent out there, that break that you took, that you were able to
Mm.
hopefully decompress? What did you walk away with from that experience?
New Mexico had long been a sanctuary for me. You'll recall that my grandmother came from Hagerman, and I had relatives in the Albuquerque area that I had visited, uh, repeatedly during the summers as a kid. And then after the first Gulf War, when I came back, I had been in the Army long enough by that time to have worked with a number of different individuals who were approaching either retirement or the end of their service and anticipating life as a veteran. And for so many of those folks, they had never anticipated what would that mean? Who would they be? Um, and I'd known of a couple of folks who had died by heart attacks, right? Within 6 months of leaving the Army. I had seen some things in my practice, my clinical practice, that really nudged me towards, listen, it's really important to know why I'm in uniform and to renew that commitment on a regular basis so that I don't end up feeling trapped and angry and resentful, or uh, even short of that, don't end up completely out of sorts when I do leave the service. And so I thought, why don't I just go to New Mexico and see if I can get some land? Um, I'll get as much land as I can. I don't need a structure right now. And so I ended up getting 106 acres south of Santa Fe. And it was a place where nobody knew my rank. Nobody, I mean, I could just let my hair down. People judged me based upon my word and my character and my integrity. Did I do what I said I was going to do? I became, a member of that community. I spent as much time as I could there in my off time. And so years later, when I met Loree, and I met her in Santa Fe with Gary Trudeau. We both landed on the doorstep of the Upaya Zen Center to attend one of her trainings. Um, it just seemed it was a convergence of forces. It once again, Providence, the fates, just was a blessing of blessings. And I think for me, once I had stepped aside from the Army, coming back to a place that had long been a sanctuary, a place of peace, of beauty, of wonderful food and music and culture, I could exhale and yet still be of service. And that's where when, Amy and Kirby contacted me about the invisible war, and I said, absolutely not. They were then, able to retort right back at me and say, that's what everyone has told us that we have asked to participate in this. What you need to understand is this is not a gotcha movie. We are using DOD's own data, and we are shining a light on an important story that we think needs to be told and needs to be acted upon. And so, of course, on that basis, I had the best of both worlds because I was able to exhale and really decompress there in the beauty of George O'Keeffe's land, and just really luxuriate in that openness and that period of rest. But at the same time, I could participate in something that went on to help countless decision makers, policy makers, survivors of sexual assault, their family members. It's something that I it was kind of a yin yang balance, and New Mexico provided me with that balance, and I'm so grateful for it. I think what you just said about preparing and leveraging whatever you can to take advantage of the most important resources, and that is time.
Yeah. And I mean, again, coming from your background, like it should be a kind of a no-brainer for a conversation that somebody would have with you to say, what do we do about this? Because what happens is a lot of folks get out, and myself and Victor see this a ton. We discuss this with people daily. They get out of the military, or they transition out, or they retire out, and then they hit this black hole, this kind of void. And it's up for a lot of people. It's unexpected. Even if we're in the conversations talking about it, even if we're having discussions about it, even if we're talking about it on the podcast a lot, people hit that point. Maybe they just kind of brush it off and be like, that's not going to happen to me. And then they get to that point and they're like, what just happened?
Yep, exactly.
That's why we try to prepare people.
Yeah.
So yeah, based on that, I actually want to take a really, really sharp left turn real quick. Because I also want to be respectful of your time, and I want to get a couple of my questions in as well. I want to go back to when you were 16 years old, and I want to send you in a time machine back in time to meet your 16-year-old self, not to go back and give advice or to be like, hey, you should do this or you should do that, or you should, you know, kiss this person or not kiss this person or buy these stocks, none of that. But just to go back and sit down and have a conversation, just maybe 20-30 minute conversation with yourself. Where would you be meeting yourself? I guess in maybe Southern California. And then what would like that conversation look like?
Where I would be meeting myself, a couple of places come to mind. Certainly Laguna Beach, just such a favorite sanctuary. Once
In a
again,
beautiful place.
in a beautiful place. The water, I grew up there, and just it's an art community, it's an art colony, and it's a place of creative energy. And I would, no doubt, that's where I was going to meet and did meet up with my high school buds. Yeah, a few years later, when I applied for that HPSP scholarship. I wouldn't have known that at the time at age 16, but knowing what I know now, as you said, and going time traveling back, I would ask myself, how are you doing on becoming whole? And how are you doing on seeking wisdom? Becoming whole, that was something that I just grew up with and adopted as sort of a living mantra and an overarching goal in life. For many, many years, my life was compartmentalized in a number of ways, and so becoming whole was no joke. It required a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of soul searching, and so I would ask myself that question. And the second question, coming out of those early experiences, listening to Joseph Campbell and then reading his work, I just was struck with conviction that above all else in life, I wanted to seek wisdom. That would be the greatest compliment that anyone could ever pay me, if at towards the end of my life, someone thought that I might have some wisdom to share. And so I would ask myself those questions. And of course, you never arrive. You're never completely whole. You're never, you never catch up. Wisdom is kind of like the car, the part that, if you ever catch up with it, then what do? No, it's always the journey. And so those would be two things that I think would come to mind. I would think about my parents, my grandparents. I would whisper a prayer and a prayer of gratitude for the gifts that they gave me. I would whisper a prayer that, that I did them proud with using those gifts and applying them. And I would then look forward and ask myself, what's still out there? What haven't you done yet? And there's a lot. And that means something as well. I don't see myself as ever retiring. I love what I do. And it's about service. Even the horrific experience I've had in departing the Army, people would come up to me and say, you ought to write this book, you ought to set it straight, you ought to, do this, do that. But in the end, it's not about revenge. It's not about getting back. It's about serving well. And so that's where I'm focused these days. I feel like I have a foundation. I've done a lot of work that has allowed me to transform that pain to purpose and to strength. That's really, values based. And I credit so much of my experience in the Army and the mentorship and the time since the Army that I've been able to continue to learn and grow and serve. And it's really it is. It's all about service, and you know this. You know, serving others. It's not just something we do. It's who we are, and I think that's an important point. You know, so much of the focus over the last few years on returning veterans has been somehow to take returning veterans and make them, you know, strong and better civilians. And there's some truth to that. But my penchant, my passion has been, let's also take our returning veterans and their family members and recognize what strengths they are bringing back to our society that we never needed more than we do today. Social isolation, it's a plague. Our Surgeon General has said that, you know, mental health concerns, it's the pressing issue of our age, suicide epidemic all around us. And so it becomes a challenge of just never being satisfied with how things are, but still acknowledging how far things have come. But there's always another hill, there's another mountain, there's another uh, um, another level to reach. And we're at one of those inflection points right now when it comes to our understanding of trauma and what we do about it, how we talk about it, how we manage it, how we um, uh, support ourselves, support each other, and move forward to keep building this more perfect union, our country, which we know has a lot of work. We've got a lot of work in front of us. So those are the kinds of things that I think about going forward.
Yeah, it's excellent. That's yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. There's a very fine line between ambition and humility, and you're right. It becomes a treadmill if you let it, and you never reach the shiny object because the shiny object just turns into another shiny object. So
Right.
that's
Well, and
that's
to let go of this quest for perfection. You know, there was a psychiatrist who decades ago talked about the trap that parents will get into, you know, thinking they've got to be a perfect parent. And he coined the term good enough parenting. And I think there's a lot of applications to life. What does good enough mean anyway? It's good enough. And that's a beautiful, I've carried that with me since I first studied it back in residency training. I just love that concept. Forget the perfect. Perfect is boring anyway. Good enough is good enough. It gives you time and energy and bandwidth to go on to something else.
Yeah, I've got there's a guy that I follow and watch a bunch of his videos. He's got a YouTube channel called The Spirited Man. It's an excellent YouTube channel. It goes into a little bit of philosophy, but that's one of the things that he says. He's a filmmaker and does a lot of film stuff and does a lot of art stuff. And he said that for me, he's like, that perfection thing is crazy. Like, if it's good enough, just send it, just put it out there, and so I can get it out of my mind and get on to the next thing. And yeah,
exactly.
Great. Speaking of all of these books, I've got a ton of notes written down for this interview. But I do want to ask you, you mentioned a few books, and I'm definitely going to put those in the show notes afterwards and let people know about them. But I want to know if there's a particular book that you have actually gifted to other people multiple times, one of your favorite books to give away to somebody or to recommend to somebody who maybe a patient, or maybe somebody in an organization, a veteran organization, or somebody, just the kind of book that you give to somebody and you're like, this book will really be good for you. It'll be good for your soul. Anything like that?
Yeah. So I mentioned years ago when I was still in uniform, The Spider and the Starfish. That was a book I gave out and I shared with folks on a regular basis. Years later, when I found out about the work on mobbing, that handbook, the book that I first discovered was all of the research. It was like a textbook. And then the next book that they came out with, Maureen Duffy and Lynn Sperry, were the two authors, and they did a handbook. So for survivors of the mobbing experience. And I've given that out countless times. I think when it comes to and let me back up a minute. I learned more about being a woman in uniform after I got out of the uniform than I ever knew before during that work with the Invisible War. And one of the facts that just still strikes me today, when you think about it, is that 2/3 of sexual assault survivors, men and women, 2/3 of them go on to experience and to report retaliation, which is another way of describing the mobbing process. And they describe how that experience of retaliation in their unit, in their organization, within their communities, sometimes even within their families, that experience can be worse, much worse than the initial assault experience. So that's been an important touchstone. I, of course, every Easter I'll, read the New York Times article, Eugene Kennedy interviewing Joseph Campbell about the Earth, Earthlink, and the meaning of Easter. That just warms my soul. And of course, the power of myth, that it's not unusual where I'll find someone and that will come to me. I'll recommend that as something that they may find useful. He also has a book, Thou Art That. Unbelievable book, Thou Art That. And I think it was posthumously, they pulled together a lot of his writings. For decades, he had puzzled over the question of why is it that individuals, like one example would be you're at the subway station in New York City and you see a complete stranger who has fallen down and is in danger of being killed by the oncoming train. And you leap into action. You don't think about it. You leap into action. And he just, drove himself a little bit, to distraction with this question. Why do people do that? And this book, Thou Art That, is his lifetime's worth of efforts to understand and to answer that question. It's great. Now, there's some other books, I would say, in terms of veteran transition, Tribe, Sebastian Younger. What a great book. And of course, he wrote War, and there's the Restrepo, the movie. When I think about love, survival love, which of course is what we develop in combat under life-threatening conditions, the most beautiful example or rendition, description of that kind of love is the tribute that Sebastian Younger wrote to his battle buddy, Tim Hetherington. That was published in Vanity Fair, I think. It's the most beautiful rendition and tribute. His buddy was killed in the early days of the Syrian conflict. And so I've recommended that from time to time. It's just something that just lands deep in one's soul. Other books, going way back, Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death. Our culture is so averse to embracing death as an integral part of the life cycle, and we pay an enormous price for that. And Ernest Becker, he was a philosopher. He wrote a lot of different things on different topics, but he, much like Joseph Campbell with the Thou Art That, he considered this to be really his high water mark in terms of the topic that had consumed so much of his time and attention and thought over the years. And I think it's, to this day, it's a book well worth reading. I can look back here. Tom Friedman, Thank You for Being Late. This is a great book. And of course, Tom Friedman has been writing for the last, in fact, another book that I took to the first Gulf War, was from Beirut to Jerusalem. And, I wanted to understand the culture of these lands. And Tom Friedman had been stationed in Beirut and Jerusalem as a reporter during those early wars back in the 70s. And what a gripping grasp he has of history. And I continue to draw on his wisdom. This book came out just a few years ago, and its title draws from the fact that it comes from the notes he would scribble down as he would meet someone for lunch and they would be late, so he would have time to scribble or to have conversations that otherwise wouldn't occur. And so he said, thank you for being late. Here's one, Odysseus in America, Jonathan Shea. This one, his early book, Odysseus in America, and I'm blocking on the I'll think of it. Anyway, his early insights in terms of, Odysseus in America, combat trauma, and the trials of homecoming. What a book this is. Another book, Brian Dories has written a book on the theater of war. It's a gripping memoir, but it also has real-time importance because Brian has developed his work. We met back in 2008 and have been working together ever since. Look up his theater of war productions. His work has gone around the world now, bringing together stories, bringing together communities, cultivating conversations that otherwise just simply wouldn't occur. I'm The Lucifer Effect. This is another one. Phil Zimbardo. He wrote this book after the Abu Ghraib tragedy in early Iraq, 2004. He kept these stories to himself. He headed up the Stanford prison experiments, and that's where they learned they had to stop them early because when individuals, and these were well-balanced Stanford, university students, when given the authority to hurt their fellow human beings, they would do that. And it's gripping in its impact. Oh, here, look at here's overcoming mobbing.
Okay.
So overcoming mobbing. This is the recovery guide for workplace aggression and bullying, and this is the book that I first was introduced to this work. And this is the textbook, Mobbing: Causes, Consequences, and Solutions. So anyway, this is the most recent book that I'm reading right now. I just got this last week. I've gotten into working on the psychedelic front, and of course that's what brought us together. So this book, right. I'm really interested to read it. Trippy, The Peril and Promise of Medicinal Psychedelics. So maybe that brings us full circle.
It does,
terms of a few books.
That's it. And that's an excellent segue because I did want to touch on that. I mean, that's really the keystone of why we actually linked up together and are doing this interview in the first place. I do want to dig into that, and I want to find out from the veteran perspective, if somebody in the veteran community who's gotten out, they're doing their medical care through the VA or through even TRICARE or something like that. I want to try to kind of bust the myth on what is acceptable, what's not acceptable as far as some of this research, what's being done, and then the people that, what can they do to get involved to actually become patients or become part of this treatment research without then also violating whatever rules and putting themselves at risk with the VA for their VA benefits or something like that.
Yeah, so great question, and it's one that's ever evolving. It's a very dynamic space right now, which is a good thing.
Yep.
For anyone, whether as an individual or an organization who wants to get involved with the veterans who are leading this charge, there's the Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition. And Adam Marr is, he's the guy who also leads the podcast for the American Legion now. And I can get you that information, but that's a great organization. They're involved legislation in a number of states, at the federal level. And I regularly join their meetings. I've learned so much from them, and how to know that something new and different is afoot. The legislation that is still under consideration, but that has been co-sponsored by the hottest of bedfellows, political bedfellows. Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Texas, and AOC, Democrat from New York, and on the Senate side, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, and Senator Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey. So it's an amazing time, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I know you're aware that what was widely expected to be a green light back in early June, the Federal Advisory Committee that was convened by the FDA, turned out to be anything but that. It was nearly unanimous, their recommendations to disapprove MDMA for treating PTSD, stating that their review of the issues of the literature, of the studies that have been brought forward, that there was insufficient evidence of efficacy, and there was insufficient evidence that the benefits outweighed the risk. Now, this was a sort of shot heard around the world. Not even the detractors and critics expected that outcome. And what's come out of this is that, a number of folks have just assumed, well, that's a done deal. They assume that the decision has been made. No. This is an FDA advisory group. Their decision is not binding upon the FDA. Now, to be sure, the FDA historically, tends to honor and to abide by its advisors' decisions, but not always. And so we're in the waiting period now. It's anticipated that August 11 is the date by which the FDA will make its decision. What's happened since early June is there's been a consensus statement reflecting the views of 23 highly expert and experienced specialists and researchers and clinicians specifically in the field of psychedelics. And they have reviewed the evidence, and their conclusion is that this drug, first in class, MDMA, that there is sufficient evidence to move forward, and that any issues that were brought up at the June 4th hearing, and there were some important issues for sure, but that they can be dealt with in a post-marketing evaluation study and report, and that we can move forward to continue to develop this treatment. So we'll see. It's not clear what's going to happen. I've got a piece that I think I'll probably post on my LinkedIn in the next day or two. Will the FDA go wobbly? So I'll send that to you as well. I don't know which way it will go, but I think that the momentum is clear. The trend line is clear. My hope is that we will get an affirmative response in August, but even if they need more time or require additional study, the trend line is still clear. We're going in the direction of, harnessing the power of these drugs, these medications that decades ago showed such promise, but because of the mistakes that were made then, that led to 50 years of prohibition, we can't risk allowing that to happen again. So it's a question. I'll say, just taking a step back for a moment, I'm frequently asked, why in the world are veterans and their family members taking the lead in this campaign to legalize psychedelics for PTSD, depression, other forms of distress? And there's an easy answer to that. These are veterans and their loved ones who have been failed by the status quo, by treatment as usual.
Yep.
20 years ago, we started out with the research and the treatments that were there. We didn't have research that really dealt with the impact of combat trauma. So prolonged exposure. It had a robust body of research, largely single episode sexual assault survivors, rape victims. No one's saying that that's an easy experience by any means, but time has shown us that this treatment is not meeting the moment for complex combat-related PTSD. Only 1 in 2 are able to tolerate it. Over half of those who are able to complete the treatment still have the diagnosis. So certainly, whether it be cognitive processing treatment or prolonged exposure, they've helped some folks, but not nearly enough. And the good news is that there are other emerging breakthrough treatments beyond even the psychedelics. And that's where I get really excited, because my work right now is I want to build the model. I'm working right now with some really smart folks to build out a new model for treating PTSD. And it's called the PTS reset model. And as you go across the PTS continuum, it's pain, spiritual pain, physical pain, addiction, all that goes with that. It's the trauma symptoms, the nightmares, the flashbacks, and it's the sleep disruption. The most common issue for folks who are suffering from trauma. All of those dimensions of PTSD have to be addressed. And we're in a position now where there have been many veterans who have been failed. That's another point. I will not say that the veteran failed the treatment. The treatment failed the veteran. And our research now can go towards bringing forward these breakthrough treatments that have shown promising impacts, but had not been adequately invested in terms of research to accelerate and catalyze their emergence. So, for example, one that I've been very involved in working with, reconsolidation of traumatic memories, no drugs, 4 to 5 hours, 2 to 3 sessions, and an enormously promising rate of symptom improvement and removal of the diagnosis. I mean, upwards of 80 to 90%. It's just remarkable. And it's a whole phenomenon, this body of evidence that emerged in the late 60s about memory reconsolidation. It didn't come from the clinical community. It came from the neuroscientists. And so it's been difficult for the clinical community to pay attention. But there are other things, neuromodulation. So, for example, transcranial magnetic stimulation. There are some really promising impacts there. Stellate ganglia, the nerve block. And then, of course, MDMA-assisted therapy. So my passion and penchant at this point is to both advocate for bringing forward the breakthrough treatment, psychedelic and otherwise, and incorporating them into a PTS reset model that just doesn't go just halfway to resolving the PTS symptoms and, pain, trauma, and sleep disruption, but go the full way into investing in wholeness, in performance therapies, in the holistic and the service dog and equine and any number. There's no cookie cutter response here, but not only clearing the trauma, but also clearing the brush that will allow individuals then to fully invest in service and life and purpose and passion and meaning going forward. And I think that the VA's whole health cultural model is ideally timed to reflect and to support this kind of approach. And so I'm very excited about it. But I do think that the current offerings are woefully inadequate. And I think that given where we find ourselves, still in the middle of this suicide epidemic, there ought to be a whole lot more acceleration and catalyzing of these promising practices. And I think there needs to be a shakeup at the National Center for PTSD. They've gone from 7 recommended therapies in the clinical practice guidelines that came out in 2017, last year, 2023, narrowed that down to 3 with no new clinical strategies. It's unconscionable. So, there's work to be done. The VA has done so many things right and so many things good and well. For example, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they have recommended national adoption of the whole health cultural paradigm shift, the whole health program. It's amazing, really, how much they've gotten right. But it's maddening on this front, with suicides still occurring at epidemic levels, that we're still in this situation. So that's where I think there needs to be a shakeup. And that's, nobody can hurt me at this point in my life. And so, if there's something that needs,
I want to be a voice for those who have.
I think I lost you, John.
Yeah. Saw you blink away there for a minute.
Yeah. Anyway, I just feel I'm not patient on this issue. I'm not patient really in general. You may have gathered that, but on this issue, it's not about change for change's sake. It's about change for the greater good. It's about change to save lives. And so that's what I'm up to.
So I guess I just wanted to kind of break it down for simplicity's sake. I mean, of course, I'm not a doctor. I don't try to play one. But I do understand that a lot of the drugs that we use for these kind of therapies, and even the therapies themselves, are very singular minded, like they're pointed at this specific problem or this specific issue. And I think you're right, like the holistic thing. And that's why I really wanted to touch base with you on the MDMA thing. I mean, there's psilocybin, there's all kinds of different things, but it's not just about the psychedelics and the hallucinogenics. It's about figuring out what works for the individual and what's long lasting. Because ideally, what I would say personally, and again, this is just my own personal opinion, is not having to take a reuptake inhibitor many times a week over many months, over many years. And instead take 1 to 5 sessions of whatever treatment combination and have that last up to 3 months, 6 months, 12 months.
Absolutely. And, there are some policy changes that need to happen right now that don't require any further research. For example, if a veteran today has major depressive disorder, is losing weight, can't sleep, is contemplating suicide, is having difficulty thinking, relationships are paying a price, they cannot get access to ketamine, which is ketamine. The research on ketamine and major depressive disorder, and increasingly PTSD as well, but certainly it's established for major depressive disorder. A veteran has to be failed by 2 of the existing medications, so the SSRI inhibitors you mentioned as well, and there are only 2 drugs that have been approved in the last 20 years, but has to go through a failure twice before they can be referred to ketamine therapy. Well, I'll tell you, that's 6 to 8 weeks per therapy, 3 to 4 months. That's not an answer for someone who is desperately in need of life-saving intervention today. So there are things that are going to take some more time. The FDA, even if they approve MDMA in August, and I hope that they will, even if they can't go so far at this point to approve it nationally, hey, how about approving it for use and study within the VA system, throughout the VA system, so that veterans can enroll in the studies more easily. The way I got involved in this subject was in 2010 when I read I said this during my testimony. I read a Military Times article, and in it, a soldier talked about how he had gotten his life back through registration through enrollment in MDMA assisted therapy, and how he now had, he'd had survival guilt when he returned from Iraq and his buddies didn't. And now he had it all over again because he was able to get this treatment and others weren't. So that is my fallback. If you can't do it nationally, do it first for the VA, and then also in kind of a flanking maneuver, accelerate the breakthrough non-MDMA treatments within the VA, within the military, within the Department of Defense, that are scalable and fully appropriate for the DoD active reserve and National Guard population. Non-drug, brief, accessible, tolerable, and lasting. And if we could get those two avenues of approach going full tilt, that would be a great thing. And we would once again be in the position of being able to offer the nation, offer the world, the benefit of our experience in uniform and as veterans. That's work worth doing for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as one real quick question on the MDMA front, will this essentially, the MDMA, assuming that it gets approved in August, will this kind of open the door and set the precedence for the other psychedelic therapies, or is that
Well, certainly it's the first in class, so it's the first to be considered. But psilocybin, you mentioned, it's moving up like
stage
gangs
3 now, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So there are others that are in the pipeline that haven't yet gotten to the point where they can apply for that new drug, authority, but they're getting there very, very, very fast. So I think the next few months and years, it's really an exciting time to see how things can advance and suffering can be alleviated and lives can be saved.
Well, look, we're at the 2-hour mark, surprisingly. And I just want to kind of wrap it up and ask you, is there anything we haven't talked about, that we haven't touched on, that maybe you feel is important that we need to bring to light before we kind of wrap it up?
A couple of things, maybe. I think that the vet centers, and this is something I learned first through Max Cleland, who is the youngest secretary of the VA after he got back as a triple amputee from Vietnam. He and his generation of Vietnam veterans, they fought for those vet centers, storefront, accessible, have a cup of coffee. I call them the front porch to the rest of a veteran's life. If you're, whether you're an established veteran, an old soldier like me, or just coming out, find your nearest vet center. There are over 300 of them across the country. Really important. Connection, community, get connected. And it's not going to be the same for everyone. There's no cookie cutter response, but we do know that as social creatures, we're wired for connection, and that's where that book Tribe comes from. Definitely required reading for a new veteran just coming out of uniform. So I think that would be one thing. I would just say the vet center as a first stop, and then whether it's your church, whether it's veteran service organizations like the Classic Six, go there and get yourself registered with the VA healthcare. If you have a disability, get all of that figured out. Really important step in the process. But then figure out what is it that you want to do? How do you want to continue to serve your community? Renew your identity, your purpose, your passion. Well, there are a lot of organizations, whether it be, Team Red, White, and Blue, doing recreational stuff, the Mission Continues, IAVA, just all kinds of organizations. And beyond the veteran world, are you interested in gardening? Are you interested in, philosophy? Are you going back to school? I mean, whatever it is, but stay connected. That social support and that peer-to-peer bond is so, so, so important. So that's one thing I would emphasize. And I guess the other piece of it is, if you are called to lead change, it's a noble calling, and it's a journey not for the faint of heart. There's a story from nature that really I return to on a regular basis and remind myself of this dynamic, these principles behind leading change. So Elizabeth Santor, she's an evolutionary biologist, and she tells the story of the metamorphosis of a butterfly. So you have the caterpillar who eats pretty much. I mean, he's just, grossly full of himself, and he eats his own weight on a daily basis. And then at some point, that stuff starts to transition, and there become little things called imaginal discs. And at first, the immune system of the caterpillar is strong enough to clobber those imaginal discs as they surface. They're recognized as other than me, so the immune system takes hold. But at some point, the imaginal discs continue to increase in number, and at some point, there's a transformation. And the chrysalis forms, and out of that, of course, comes the butterfly. And so the lesson in leading change for me is clear. Don't try to be an early imaginal disc. Know that the immune system of the status quo is going to fight back. Get as many imaginal discs or fellow travelers or like-minded peers to lead that change together and to overcome the immune system of the status quo, so that transformational change then can take place, and can take place in the context of relationship, of mutual support, of shared values, of community. And that's really a good place to stop for now. Living in community and connection.
Yeah, it's exceptional. Like I said, I've taken tons of notes. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. It's been great to meet with you, at least virtually, and to sit down with you. It's been an amazing talk.
Well, likewise, it's really a privilege, John. I'm so glad that you reached out, and if I can be of any assistance whatsoever, just you know how to reach me. Just reach to me direct. I know at the time you initially reached out, I had to have someone I was working with connect with you, but don't hesitate to reach out directly. The best way to get my attention is to text me, and I'll make sure that you've got my cell number, and let's consider this as an ongoing dialogue, an exchange of wisdom, of ideas, of two beggars telling each other where they've found bread.
Absolutely love that. Thank you for that invitation. And just for everybody out in the audience as well, who's listening or watching, if you wanted to point them somewhere directly to come find you, find out what you're doing, learn more about what we've talked about or anything like that, where would you want them to go?
That's a work in progress. I don't have a website. You could Google me and you'll see a sprinkling of things going on. I am working on a website that will be that kind of a platform that can show what I'm doing, and offer the opportunity, the invitation for others to join in. But at this particular point, I'm really reaching out and responding to folks like yourselves, other veteran leadership groups. And, I'm inspired by our conversation today to go and update my LinkedIn profile and to post that op-ed, Will the FDA Go Wobbly? So maybe that's the best way. Short of a website at this point, I don't have that, and I'm not very good at sort of, I don't know, that's not been a big priority for me, but I recognize at this point that it's important for people to know what's going on, to know how they can get involved. And so I would point to my LinkedIn profile, and I will get that updated over this weekend. Promise.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and put your LinkedIn in there, and I'll cut your email out for now. If you want to put it back in, we can try to stick it back in there, but I want to kind of protect you. I know I understand why you have the gatekeeper in place after this conversation that we've had, so totally makes sense.
It just came to me as you talked to me. I a year ago, I went ahead and applied and stood up an LLC, Sutton Synergies, but I just haven't developed the website or anything to go with it. But I'm inspired now. I'm going to get after my LinkedIn, and that's the best way.
For everybody out there in the audience, thank you for listening, watching, sticking around this very long conversation. But I think there's a whole lot of good nuggets in there for you to grab onto. We'll timestamp everything so you can find what you're looking for. And we'll see you later.
Thanks, John. Stay strong.
All right, thank you.